Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast that is always up to speed with Formula One. Mark Daly here. Just a little intro for the show tonight. Mark is waiting on deck, sort of, kind of, but not really. We're not doing a show together as we usually do, but earlier today we joined our good friend Tim Hauraney from TSN to recap the Australian Grand Prix for the TSN Racing Pod. So we've got that coming up for you, and as always, please check out everything that Tim's got going on. You can give him a follow on Twitter at Tim Hauraney. And you can find his podcast, the TSN Racing Pod, at tsn.ca/tsn-racing-pod, or on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Anyways, that's enough from me. Tim, take it away.
Joined by Mark Daly and Mark Hamilton from the Scuderia F1 Pod. Mark Daly, what's up, man? How are you? How's everything? Did you enjoy the racing this weekend?
Oh boy, did I ever. I'm doing great, thanks. And it was a bit of a weird situation, was it? I was trying to remember what it was like in Australia before, but it's been like, 3 years since we've been there? So it was great to be back down under for Formula One.
And Mark Hamilton, yourself? I mean, hey, you got sun there, dude. It's like nighttime over here, man. What's going on?
Dude, I am doing fantastic. And it was so great to be back in Australia in very different circumstances. We knew there was going to be a race. And it was also great for us in the Pacific time zone because we're so used to those 5 a.m., 6 a.m. starts that it was super cool to be able to watch qualifying and to be able to watch the race in prime time. For us, it was kind of like a sneak preview of what it's going to be like for Vegas next year, that we've got that beautiful 10 p.m. time slot. And I know for all your listeners in Europe, this weekend was agony because it was an early start. But for at least for us on the Pacific coast of North America, it was beautiful.
Oh man, the Eastern time zone. I got crushed, dude. I didn't get to bed till 5 a.m. each morning.
Ouch.
And then could only sleep till 10 o'clock at the latest. So I've been running on 4 hours, 5 hours sleep for the past, 3-4 days. So hasn't been too easy, man. But let me tell you who had it easy was Charles Leclerc, because guys, I mean, Ferrari looks absolutely incredible in Australia. Leclerc finishes with 22nd lead over second place Sergio Perez. I mean, it's unheard of, especially in this, supposed to be new wave regulation of Formula One. I thought it would be a little bit closer this weekend, guys, to be perfectly honest with you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the one thing we can say now is that Ferrari is legit. At the start of the season, I'm always very conservative when it comes to making predictions and saying so and so is going to be an out and out title contender, just because, especially this year more than any other year, because everything's so brand new. And I mean, Charles has now won 2 out of 3 races, and he's looked awesome in all 3 of them. But today, I mean, except for that one restart from behind the safety car, we looked a little bit shaky through those first couple of corners till he found his groove again and then took off. I mean, he really was unchallenged for the entire race. You can't say the same thing for his poor old teammate, but Charles looks pretty darn good.
Daly, you make a good point too, because that 20.5 second gap between Charles and Sergio is awfully misleading because of those safety cars. You take the safety cars out of this race and maybe he wins by a solid minute, because you're right, with the exception of a little bit shaky with Max after that one safety car restart. Aside from that, this was just a dominating performance the whole weekend from Charles Leclerc.
Yeah, absolutely. He was incredible. That pole lap that he stitched together on Saturday was mesmerizing, man. I think, and a couple of things that I noticed the most out of that pole lap was just how much grip the Ferrari has, especially in turns 1 and the high-speed left-hander at turn 9. Going into both of those corners, the entry, the car looks sweet, but once he goes back to power, because sometimes you got to roll the speed into the corner a bit and wait for the car to settle before you can kind of get back on the power. He's back on the power instantaneously. It's very impressive how much grip that Ferrari has. And same with Red Bull. Red Bull looks impressive too through 9 and 10, but that's kind of just what stood out the most to me with that Ferrari this weekend. I don't know what stood out the most to you guys, but yeah, for me, it was incredible to watch them go through there.
He looked like he was on rails. Pardon me, Mark, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think, Tim, it was actually you that maybe maybe tweeted this on Friday, maybe it was Thursday night, that the Ferraris were bouncing a lot this weekend as well. And when I saw that in free practice, my assumption was they were going to lose some serious time this weekend through free practice and qualifying. And maybe it's going to be a little bit more competitive with Red Bull. But despite the fact that those cars were bouncing pretty aggressively along some of those high speed straights, it didn't seem to have any impact on their performance at all, which was pretty darn remarkable, because I seriously thought there was going to be some challenges there, but it didn't seem to make a difference to Charles. Like his top end speed, his balance in the corners, to your point, the stability coming out of a corner and getting back on the throttle, none of that seemed to be compromised.
Yeah, he said he actually, watching how much porpoising he had going on in the car, especially in lead up to like turn 9, because obviously you have that really, the new back straightaway there, the new pavement that they laid down and getting rid of that old chicane. The amount of downforce is getting generated, going down that straightaway, and to see how much, he's porpoising and his head's like bouncing around. I don't know how, and he did talk about this after, but I don't know how he was able to pick out the reference points that he needed for braking and turning in, because it's such like a technical, it's such a technical corner, right? Not a lot of people would get it, but it's like, it's trying to like thread the eye of a needle, because you can't get the turn in, you can't get the braking or the turn in like wrong in that corner, because there's so much load transferring with that car. Like, it's absolutely incredible, like what Charles is able to do. And he even said like the porpoising for him, it just didn't really bother him leading up to that, and how like the downforce got reactivated. I don't know if you guys noticed that at all, but like when I saw like the Mercedes, right, porpoising so much going down that straightaway, and then once Lewis or George gets to the braking zone, they kind of roll the car into the corner, and then you're waiting for them to kind of get back onto the power, because they're still kind of sluggishly bouncing around. Now that might have a lot to do with the ride height that they were running to help cure some of the porpoising, but you can just see the stark contrast between, the Mercedes and the Ferrari in that sort of combination. But for Charles, like, yeah, he even said like the porpoising for him, just he didn't find it that intrusive heading into that turn, where I think for Carlos it was kind of a different story. And I think for Carlos in general, Daly, he had a tough weekend, man.
Oh, totally. But I just wanted to build on your thoughts there. Just I love the change that they made on the back of the circuit, getting rid of that old chicane with that right-left combo, and just streamlining it. And I loved how it came down, because the next corner was still pretty much the same. But I just love the amount of speed that they were able to pick up on that back straight. And it was a fascinating corner to watch, because like you say, we saw like multiple different cars dealing with that porpoising issue. We saw how Carlos got it wrong, went off to the grass, and then ended up burying it into the gravel, which ended a pretty miserable weekend for him. But then we saw, who else did we see? We saw Magnussen have the same problem. He just outbraked himself. But then we saw that really impressive overtake from Sergio. He actually nailed it going into that corner. He got a little bit deep, but compared to K-Mag and to Carlos, he was able to just, I guess by the skin of his teeth, keep it on the track, even though he ran a little bit deep. But yeah, well, just talking about Carlos now, what a miserable weekend. He qualified in, what was it, 9th, and then his weekend was done pretty quick there. It was just, it was pretty bad. He was on the podium the first 2 races of the year, and now no points. And that's the thing, what I find interesting too. If you look at the constructors, Ferrari has 104 points. Mercedes incredibly has 65 in the constructors for second place. And then Red Bull has 55. It's interesting, because if you look at all the DNFs that we've seen from Ferrari and Red Bull through the first 3 races of the season, just how many points that they've left out on the track. And Carlos, obviously he's going to be upset and frustrated with what happened in Melbourne this weekend, but where he's obviously left a lot of points out on the track. But I'm just getting that feeling, despite what happened to Bahrain and Saudi, I feel that there's just general frustration in his season so far, that he's not getting the results that he wants. And I don't know, guys. What does Carlos Sainz do now? Does he just take a couple of days off for a mental health break and just try and get his get in the right headspace and refocus and come back for the next Grand Prix and just try and start over again? I don't know, Tim, what do you think? Mark, ideas? I'm kind of like throwing stuff at the wall here and see what'll stick when it comes to Carlos Sainz. Yeah,
I don't think we need to panic. The reality is we're 3 Grand Prix into a 23 race season. It was a bad weekend. It was a miserable weekend. I would have expected more from him. I'm sure the Formula One team, Matteo Binotto, et cetera, probably very much expected more. It's disappointing as well because despite the fact that Ferrari have an almost 40-point lead in the Constructors' Championship after just 3 races, that could be oh so much more. And really, it would have played into the hands of Red Bull Racing, but because of that DNF that you just spoke to with Max, it ultimately ended up playing into the hands of Mercedes. And Mercedes, despite all the criticism, every corner of the internet is what's wrong with Mercedes, what's going on. Despite all of that, they're second in the championship. So they have absolutely benefited by the lack of reliability from Red Bull and some of these driver errors. And I really say, or I would argue, that everything that was wrong with Carlos this weekend was not car related because Leclerc's package was perfect. That was more driver related. But it really puts Mercedes in a really great position that, hey, if we're not seeing the best of Mercedes and that car's only going to evolve and continue to improve over the rest of the season, they may look back in the first month of the season and say, oh my God, those points that we were able to scrape together are absolutely crucial to our championship hopes. Because I know people are quick to write them off. That just seems to be the world that we live in right now. There's a lot of exaggeration and hyperbole, but we're still only 3 races into a record 23 race championship. And even Charles Leclerc today, after the race, was being interviewed, and he said, look, you know what, some of my success so far has been a little bit luck. And he's like, you know what, I am going to make mistakes. Everyone is going to make mistakes over the course of the championship, and his will come. He's not going to win every single race. He's not going to finish top 2 every single race, but kudos to Mercedes. And I know that's not necessarily the topic we're on right now, but kudos to Mercedes for continuing to hoover up points when they really shouldn't be available to them.
Yeah, just circling back on Carlos, because I think he expected a lot more from himself, this weekend, hearing from him after qualifying and following the races as well. He's very upset with himself for a few reasons, right. Obviously for the mistakes that have been made, but at the same time, he understands that he has a car that's capable of winning at the moment, capable of winning a championship. And for Carlos, he's never been in that position in Formula One. And this is the first time that that's ever happened. And I think for him, he might feel like, hey, like I'm blowing this at the moment and I really need to start getting it together so I can at least take the fight to Charles and make sure that the team doesn't consider him as the number 1 driver. Because like we know, and we can touch on this topic in just a second, because I wanted to bring up something else before it. Like we know, there's going to be a point in the season where Ferrari's going to do a cutoff line saying that, hey, whoever is going to be leading or ahead in the championship, we're going to put our focus there. And then the other driver is just going to play back up to the first place driver. Just another quick point I wanted to make about Carlos. So like when he goes off, he goes into the gravel, beaches the car. I'm starting to get a bit of an issue with this, because I think that there was no damage done to the car, and he's on the team radio and he's sitting there and he's telling them, hey, there's no damage done here. And I can get back into the fight. Team tells him to select reverse. He buries himself a bit. So then he decides to tell them, hey, I'm just going to turn the engine off and see what these marshals decide to do. And that's it. That's the end of his race, right? There's no, hey, let's try and get this car back out onto the racetrack and give this guy a chance. It's like, no, you're done. You get out of the car, your race is over. It's this beached rule that they kind of have here. And I got a problem with it, because I think at the end of the day, we want to see as many cars out, during a race, fighting for points, fighting with other cars, especially for a Ferrari. If you're a Ferrari fan, you want to see them back in the race. Like, I got text messages, DMs from Ferrari fans, absolutely livid about all of that. And they make a good point. Here's my question to you guys. Would you like to see them be able to just put the car back into the race instead of just saying, okay, that's it, you're done, get out?
Yeah, well, why not? I mean, we kind of saw something like that last year at Imola when Lewis got into the gravel. Remember, he slid off on that really greasy track. And I mean, that was more him sort of putting into reverse and kind of sliding out in slow motion, but he was able to get going. I mean, sure, why not? I mean, the thing is, I mean, at that point, Carlos was going to be at the very end of the running order. So, I mean, he had his work cut out. I mean, unfortunately for Carlos, I mean, at the start of the race, as quickly as Charles was rocketing up the track, Carlos was going backwards through the race order. I was almost kind of wondering, did he select the wrong gear because he was going backwards so quickly? But sure, I mean, when it comes to something like that, why not? I mean, it's like, if the car's not damaged, give him an opportunity and let him see if he can work himself back up. I mean, he was already a country mile behind, but sure, why not?
I guess the other consideration too here is not so much the rules or the philosophy of the individual teams, but rather track construction itself, right? Like, if you're going to build a track that has fairly narrow margins because it's kind of a hybrid street track, hybrid dedicated track in a city park, you're going to be forced to use sand and gravel to slow down cars to make sure they don't have any high-speed impacts with the wall. Like, really, to me, this comes down to more the philosophy of track design. Like, if this was Paul Ricard, which is just oceans of tarmac and asphalt, he goes off, he recovers, he loses 10 places, but he's right back in the race. Mm-hmm. Based on the nature of this track and the way it's designed, it was very unlikely anyone's ever going to get out of that car or out of that trap because, like you said, he's completely beached. So maybe this just goes back to the way that the FIA enforces the regulations around how these tracks are built, because if we don't like seeing cars go off this wasn't an innocent incident, and he was very lucky he didn't collect a couple of cars and bring them into the gravel with him. But the reality is that exact same mistake on other tracks would have been easily recoverable, and he would have been back in the race, and we never would have talked about it. We're only talking about it because he got into this gravel, and it's not so easy to get out again.
Yeah, but what's stopping them from like hooking up a tow chain to the top of the roll bar and just hauling them out like they do in IndyCar? Like, what's stopping them from doing that?
Yeah,
you know what I mean? And it's kind of like, because like he didn't want to get out of the race, like even though he had dropped all the way back to the back, right? Like, he didn't want to get out of the race because we've seen crazier things, right? We've seen guys come from last place and score big points in races. We've seen guys lap down and get on the podium, i.e. Imola last year. Yeah. So like, we've seen these things. So it's kind of like, I don't understand why they're still just retiring drivers as soon as they get beached. I don't know. I don't really agree with it. I would like them to take a look at it. But
you've won me over on this one, to be totally honest. It's not something that ever bothered me. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm paying X amount per race to my TV subscription to watch these races. I want to see the best cars competing at any given time. And I don't want somebody out of a race because of an instant error. And you talk about Indy, but in MotoGP, I have seen riders in MotoGP crash out, have the marshals push them to jumpstart that bike, get back into the race, and score a podium.
Score a point, yeah.
Exactly. Points, podiums. It's crazy. Yeah, I've never thought about that, Tim. You've enlightened me.
You brought up a good point about Carlos's start, and how he looked like he was going back. He would literally look like the car was in reverse, and everyone was just passing him off the start. It's interesting, and I think it's something we should keep an eye on, because I've heard about this a few times from a few different drivers, is that with this new powertrain, they're actually struggling, like getting off the line for the start of some of these races. It's like there's a slip happening, and like the car just can't get the traction it needs to get sometimes to, get the revs up. We saw a big problem with that with Valtteri Bottas in Bahrain, first race of the season. And I think Guan Yu Zhou had a similar type thing happen to him as well the next race. But regardless of that, this is something I think we should probably keep an eye on as things go forward. And another thing we'll obviously keep an eye on is, like, when does that cutoff line begin for who's going to be the first, who's going to be the favorite driver at Ferrari and who's going to be second favorite. I mean, Mark Daly, what are your thoughts on this? Because I think Charles is getting closer and closer to being the number one driver here.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's not really unprecedented territory. I mean, we saw a couple of years ago when Charles came and partnered up with Sebastian Vettel, that he really forced that issue within, well, almost a couple of races, right? So I think for the moment, just based on the fact that he's been at Ferrari for several years, I mean, he's been able to do it when he's had the car. I mean, I know this is only his fourth career victory, but in the past 2 years, he hasn't had the most competitive car. But on the other hand, you know, you want to be the best, you got to beat the best, right? And I know that Carlos kind of feels that he hasn't been able to do the job so far this year. And my whole position on this is, Carlos, if you think you're better than Charles, go for it. Prove it on the track. You know, if you can beat him head to head, then you deserve that number one spot in the team. But I think that's the way that Charles is. I mean, he hasn't put a wheel wrong basically in the first 3 races. I mean, he was just flawless this weekend. I mean, pole position, race victory, fastest lap. I mean, you know, he was a mile ahead of Sergio Perez by the time the checkered flag was waved. I mean, you know, when you see a weekend like Charles had, that's just, it's impressive. I mean, if Carlos wants to be in that conversation for the number one driver for Ferrari, he's going to have to start doing the same thing and beating Charles at his own game.
Last year, I think, may prove to have been a bit of an anomaly. Let's go back to last year, right? Carlos Sainz outscores him in the Drivers' Championship. I think Ferrari were a very nice surprise last year, finishing P3 in the Constructors, and obviously they were kind of playing down expectations. They wanted to be able to build towards a future season, which I think might be 2023. But let's be very honest, Charles is the fan favorite, and Daly, just like you said, he has been since 2019 when he erupted into the Ferrari hemisphere, scored those 2 race wins, stacked up all those podiums, was running circles around Sebastian Vettel. There was team, like, we all know what those circumstances were. I think it was just that the entire conversation was kind of, I would say, muted a little bit last year. And last year was just such a lovely, good news story for that team that they were outperforming expectations. But this year, suddenly the expectations are completely different. And clearly they both have a car that's capable of winning every single Grand Prix. And to your point, Tim, I really think that Carlos's headspace after that last race is, look, I've scored 2 podiums so far, but I was a distant first or distant second and a distant third behind Charles Leclerc. I have a car capable of winning. And I think his frustration level after beaching that car in Australia must just be in the stratosphere, that I was given a car that should be capable of winning. I could do nothing in qualifying. I qualify P9. I have a horrendous race start. And then I beach the car because I go too hot into T9, T10, can't correct, slide on the grass. And I'm lucky I didn't collect any other cars. Like, he must be incredibly frustrated. But if there's a question within the community about who that number one driver is, I think the answer is being written in stone right in front of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point that you make. I think, you know, for Carlos, he is an incredible talent. And I think we've all seen him be put into difficult, you know, situations within Formula One. He's been in Formula One for, you know, a long time. So I think for him, it's kind of like what I referred to earlier, where I think he has the understanding and knows that he has a chance here that he could win a championship. And I think he doesn't want to let this thing slip away on him. And it's kind of like, what's the saying, like squeezing the hamster, right? You know, if you really want something really bad, sometimes it kind of, you know, backfires in your face and it goes the other direction. So yeah. For Carlos, I think for him, this time off will probably serve him well. I mean, I think he's going to be able to get back into it. And I've been saying this on like radio interviews I've done, said it on Sports Center, I've said it on this podcast a ton of times. I think he's super talented. And I honestly think that like he is championship, world drivers championship material. And I think he's probably going to be sticking around at Ferrari for a little bit longer. And I also think that he's not going to play second fiddle to Charles Leclerc because he already did that with Max Verstappen. And I think that rubbed him the wrong way. And so I honestly think that Carlos Sainz is going to get back into this thing. And, you know, Hammy, you made a great point. This is a long season. We got 23 races to go, so anything can kind of happen. But the bigger issues are what's going on down at Red Bull, because that's 2 DNFs so far for Max Verstappen at the beginning of this season. I mean, it's absolutely, you know, ridiculous. I never thought that Red Bull would honestly have the issues that they are having to start off this season. At the moment, it's unclear what happened with the car. It hasn't been reported on just yet. Happened on lap 39. And yeah, it looks stable. The car looks well balanced. I mean, I think Max has trouble with it in slower speed corners, but outside of that, I mean, I think they've got a championship winning machine here.
You know, it is interesting, right? I mean, the language that you hear coming out of Max Verstappen, like the things that he's saying, I wouldn't expect to hear like the reigning world champion after 3 races saying, I'm not even thinking about the championship fight right now. I'm just thinking that, you know, I'm wanting to finish races. This is not, this is not what any of us were expecting to hear at this point in time, but obviously that they have problems. We saw with the double DNF in Bahrain, first race of the year, and then Max again today. And I thought it was interesting too, like during the race that you have Checo on the radio, talking or asking his engineer, what's the problem? And the answer pretty quick was, don't worry about what happened to Max. It's unrelated. It's irrelevant. Just focus on what you need to do. But it's almost shocking to me to see how many points that Max is like left out on the track after 3 races. Pardon me.
It also reminds me and how quickly we forget 2020, right? Because that was a 17 race championship. It was the COVID shortened championship. Hamilton kind of ran away with it and won with 350 points. But Max had 5 DNFs that year. All of them principally due to mechanical gremlins within the car. And I think what's probably a little bit concerning here, and maybe good news for Christian Horner and Helmut Marko and the whole Red Bull team, is it doesn't look like the issues that they're having are related to the power unit. Power unit seems good. It seems whole. It seems as reliable as it was last year. But given the new regulations, the fuel cell, which is where obviously the fuel bladder, it's where the fuel pump, all of the electronics are kept. It seems to be, and they said, the Red Bull team said they won't actually know what the issue is until they get the car back to Milton Keynes and they can do a complete teardown to diagnose what the issue is. But it seems to be, once again, that it's an issue within the fuel cell. And you could hear when Max pulled over that he could smell the fluid, and then promptly there's fire coming out of the back of the car. So it's good news for Red Bull that it's not the power unit, because power units are effectively frozen now, and there's not a whole lot they could do except for some minor, moderate kind of reliability tweaks. But it's also bad news that something as crucial as the fuel cell is costing you race victories at this point. And, we're through 2 races now, or Max has already had 2 DNFs. That's an absolute horror show when you think about the number of points they've left on the table. And as we talked about earlier, there's one specific team that's benefited from that. But bad news for Max. And Max was always cast last year as the villain. He was cast as the villain in Drive to Survive. And that was the narrative for so much of last year in the media. And all of a sudden, there's a little bit of sympathy for this guy who's the reigning world champion. And he's only finished 1 of 3 races and has only scored 25 points. But to your point, Tim, that car looks incredibly stable, incredibly level. The one thing that I did find that was a little bit interesting was after the race, Max was speaking to the fact that this car is eating tires alive. Whereas it seems like some teams, Williams a little bit, and definitely Ferrari, they've got great balance, great reliability, or great stability, and the car is managing the compounds well. Max had spoken to the fact that this car is just eating those tires alive, especially in high load corners. And that's not good news either. But aside from that, it seems like they've got some good things going.
And it's a particular tire too, right? I mean, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's the C4, or sorry, it's the C3 and the C5 that it's like chewing through, where once he was running like the C2s, the tire wear issue with the Red Bull isn't as bad. And it seems like when Max is in either traffic or fighting with another car, and we saw this at Saudi Arabia, was that if he was running the softer compound or the medium compound, he couldn't race. Like, he just couldn't race because the tire would just overheat, way too easily. And that's more thermal degradation that's going on there. So really interesting. And I think this is all going to change too once we start getting to different tracks with different ambient temperatures and different track temperatures as well. And I think that might change just a little bit, but they got a ton of downforce going through this car, guys. Like, they got a ton. And for some reason, they're able to just get over the porpoising issue too, with as much downforce that they're actually running. It's absolutely incredible. Interesting note though, like before the start of the race, even on Max's side, he had a ton of Parc Fermé changes to the car. So he had a clutch breakout box, gearbox, hydraulic system and actuator. I think he had a clutch actuator as well. He had an LHS deflector. He had a fuel cell loom, auxiliary radiator change. And then Sergio, he also had the auxiliary radiator changed on his as well. So, and those were rush changes too, because you could see them, like Sky Sports even showed it on their telecast of the crew at Red Bull, like furiously working underneath that car before the before the warm-up laps began.
Yep.
So they got some things going on there. But one of the things with racing that I always lived by, I always got told when I was racing, and we had a lot of car issues at some points in some different series that I raced in, is just like, hey, you can fix reliability, but you cannot fix speed or make a slow car fast quickly. You can't do it. You can fix reliability quite quickly. So I think for Red Bull on their end, that might be a saving grace, I think, the later we get into the season. Moving over to Mercedes, I mean, talking to Toto Wolff on Saturday, didn't have a ton of expectations for his team. I think he basically felt that if they got 5th or 6th, that's like a good day for them. We didn't get to talk to him after on Sunday, but that's the way he came across on Saturday when we did get to chat with him. Didn't bring any really big upgrades. Actually, didn't bring any upgrades at all for Australia, where I think some people had like reported that they were bringing like a rear wing and a new floor. And I was like, no, there's no way that's happening. That's such a huge change to make to that race car. But yeah, what did you guys think of Mercedes this weekend? Because we did touch on it just a little bit off the top there, but I mean, this is kind of gravy for them,
Yeah, and I'll touch on the upgrade piece because I was listening to the BBC Checkered Flag podcast a little bit earlier today, and somebody on the podcast made a note that hadn't really dawned on me. And, if we went back to 2019 or 15 or 13 and Mercedes came into the season, they were having this soft start, they would literally open the checkbook and just start writing checks. Building a new factory, we need to hire 50 new engineers. We need to build a new wind tunnel, do whatever it takes. And this point they made on the Checkered Flag podcast today was like, Mercedes has to be incredibly tactical, incredibly strategic, and very, very patient when it comes to the upgrades that they apply this year because they're working under a budget cap. They cannot throw money at a problem as teams would have in the past. If they throw money at the rear wing and it's the wrong upgrade or it doesn't fix the issue, that's money's gone. And there's only so much resources that they can commit because of the budget cap. So part of this could be that they're just not certain that the upgrades they have as they've been developed are going to help the car. So I think the thought is like, hey, if we're going to bring an upgrade, it's going to be a balanced upgrade, and we're going to be confident that that new floor is going to work with the new wing, which will work with the new inlets, all those kind of things, that they're not just going to simply start throwing parts at this car. One, because they don't want to compromise performance in the short term, but two, in the long term, they can't afford to make a mistake because it could cost them $1 million to develop a new floor. If it's the wrong floor, that $1 million is gone. They may not have another $1 million in the budget to redevelop it. So they've got to be very, very careful. But Tim, to your point, I think this weekend was all gravy for this team. And I think it was remarkable as well that they seemed to have significantly more race pace than they did in either practice or qualifying, right? You look at that Q3 performance, they're a second off of LeClerc. Russell and Hamilton are a second off of LeClerc. Didn't seem like there was a world in which they were going to break into the 117s, but they seemed incredibly racy. And I think the benchmark this weekend probably wasn't ever going to be LeClerc, but both Hamilton and Russell at times seemed awfully racy and awfully competitive with Sergio Perez. And if that's your benchmark right now, that's a really good benchmark because like we just talked about, aside from the reliability issues, that Red Bull package seems to be really solid.
Yeah, totally. I think you make a lot of sense in what you're saying, Mark. But I think another thing that maybe we're overlooking a little bit is just the way that they qualified too. I mean, you have Lewis and George qualifying in the second and third row. Lewis in fifth, George qualifying sixth. Like you say, they showed a lot of raciness throughout the race. I was actually surprised at that one point when Sergio overtook Lewis, and then he sort of I expected that Checo would just disappear down the track. Only like 10 or 15 laps later, or whatever. All of a sudden, you see Lewis within DRS range is just like, well, he's not going to let this thing go. And then, unfortunately, Lewis got a little bit caught out by that safety car and then ended up losing a position. But I mean, he recovered well. I mean, certainly he was helped by the some of the the retirements further up the grid. But despite what you would call a disastrous start to the season for Mercedes by their own extraordinarily high standards, I mean, to be where they are right now, it's not the end of the world. But just a funny thing. thing, you know, Tim, when you were saying, oh, we didn't get a chance to talk to Toto after the race in the media availability. I don't recall seeing Toto at all throughout the entire race broadcast. I'm thinking, when was the last time that never happened? I mean, he's like a fixture at some point that they flashed the Mercedes garage and he's there. So that was interesting.
Yeah, I chatted with him on Saturday, but didn't see him on the Sunday. I think it's interesting because if you go all the way back to when, you know, we were chatting with him in Bahrain at the end of that race, and you know, he was talking about taking a chainsaw to the back of the rear wing, and I'm like, okay, cool. And then now all of a sudden, second in the championship, right? It's kind of like, okay, well, like things aren't like that bad. Like they're bad, but they're not that bad. They've actually done a really nice job of, I think, being there when like capitalizing on others' mistakes, being there at the right time. Mm-hmm. But one of the things I noticed the most is when this race started and Lewis had a dynamite getaway. And I thought, okay, that's great. He's all the way up into third, I think it was. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, that's great. Good. You know, it's good to see. I'm like, it's probably only going to last for another few corners till that thing starts bouncing around and someone passes him like it's nobody else. It's like he's driving an ice cream truck or something and then wave at him and see you later. I didn't honestly think that car would be able to be as competitive as it was in race conditions. I think they actually really do set this car up more for the race than they do actually for like a qualifying race hybrid setup. I think it's more geared towards, hey, we got to make sure this thing gets through a full Grand Prix and is like somewhat competitive. So I think that's kind of what's going on down there when you they look at the race weekend for now anyways. I think outside of that, it's interesting to see just how, you know, like people are going to roll their eyes here, but like just how competitive George Russell's been. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's done a really nice job, and we have to talk about it because he's been competitive and he was right place, right time for this podium today, and he made it work. I think, you know, looking at this moving forward, and I'll always say this, I think George is one of the best qualifiers on the grid. And I'm going to stand by that. I think Lewis is the best overall driver. Like if you want all around good at every single thing, that's definitely Lewis for sure. Hands down. No question about it. But I think, hey, if this keeps going like this, guys, and we get to like race 10, race 11, I don't know. Like, what do you guys think? Like,
well, you know, it just demonstrates like how valuable it is to have both drivers performing, right? And having your cars finish the race, because 2-3 weeks ago, we're thinking, yeah, Mercedes is not in this. And all of a sudden after 3 races, I mean, they're only 40 points out of the lead in the constructors, which is not really a very big gap in a driver's championship when you're basically racing against somebody else. Yeah, that's a very difficult gap to close. But I mean, if you've got that 1-2 punch like you have with Lewis Hamilton and George Russell scoring points in a car that they're still struggling to really dial in and really find that sweet spot, I'd say it's still all on the table for them. I mean, it doesn't look likely, but when you see like a Ferrari and Red Bull not collecting points, and that's going to be doubly frustrating for Red Bull, because I mean, Checo has done an outstanding job the first 3 races of the season, and I think that finally since 2018 they have that legit 1-2 punch like they used to have with Max and Danny Ricciardo. I mean, last year obviously it took Sergio Perez a little while to really find his feet there, but I mean, he's been impressive through the first couple of races for the season of the season. But then at Mercedes they have that. I mean, I can't help but keep asking myself, yeah, sure, they're struggling right now, they're not doing what we usually expect them to do, but boy, if they get this car figured out, I mean, it can be a completely different story. I mean, if it keeps going too much longer, then sure, they're going to be excluded out of that, maybe that drivers' championship conversation. But I'd say based on where they are right now, I wouldn't write them off. I mean, write them off out of the constructors' championship at your own peril, because they could turn this thing around, and who knows.
Look, anyone and everybody that knows me probably recognizes that I've been awfully cool. I've been awfully
I was just going to say, Mark Hamilton is smiling.
I've been awfully cool on George Russell last year, the year before, even his rookie season. And I think my frustration got to a boiling point last year because he was receiving so much positive press and so much praise in the British media because of what he was doing with that Williams car. And at one point, out of frustration, I actually tweeted, like, how do we know he's getting everything out of that car? How do we know that car is not much more capable, right? Like, you look at the last 2 years, his frame of reference in that car was Nicky, and Nicky's fantastic. He's a solid, reliable driver, but he was younger and had less Formula One experience than Russell, and Russell should have been outperforming him. And obviously, we've had that flurry of points finishes last year, et cetera, et cetera. Please.
So yeah, just to get in on that, because I think this might back up your point a bit. So George actually, I think George actually feels that Nicholas was an extremely competitive teammate, because he even made mention of just how difficult that car was to drive and how much he had pushed George last season in particular was one of the things that he'd referenced. But yeah,
as somebody that's ride or die, Nicholas Latifi, I need to hear that this season. That makes me feel a lot better.
I'm not ride or die anybody, but like at the end of the day, I mean, you have to, like, if the guy like a George Russell is going to say
You're
that, and
objective.
again, like, you got to make sure that stays within the story frame, right?
Sure.
Dude, when Daly sits down with me and he does my quarterly podcast performance evaluation, he's like, you've got to learn to be more objective, like that Tim Hauraney guy. But, I think last year I was frustrated by the amount of praise, but everything we've seen from him this year, both on and off the track, in interviews, he seems poised, he seems humbled, he seems very, very, very deserving of this role. And on track, he hasn't stepped a foot wrong. And I think you're teasing at this, Tim. You know what? 8 races in, 10 races in, 11 races in. What happens when he consistently finds himself in a position where he's racing Lewis, or he's going head to heads with Lewis, or a strategy situation might call for team orders? Like, it's going to get awfully, awfully interesting. And I think we all knew this was going to come, but I don't think that any of us expected that he was going to adapt, 1, to the new regulations, and 2, to this car as quickly as he has. But I have nothing but praise for him. And as much as it was unfortunate for Lewis that timing of the the safety car potentially cost him the podium, I think Russell was very well deserving of it.
The safety car that's 5 seconds slower than a Mercedes, you mean?
Yeah, the one that everybody's grumbling about. So what did Max call it? A turtle? Well, I mean, I guess it's suitable because, I mean, the Aston Martin safety car is green, just like a turtle. So
good point.
Yeah.
I would love that Aston Martin, man. I think that car is sick.
Look, if they don't want it, I'll take it. I'll take it off their hands.
They're in the media room like complaining about it, and I'm like, I'll take that off your hands.
Yeah, no problem.
Want it for sure. Speaking of Aston Martin, I mean, tough weekend for Sebastian Vettel. Tough weekend for the team as a whole, really. I mean, wow, it doesn't get much worse than the weekend they had, literally crashing in almost every single session, or something happened in every single session. I mean, I think like Vettel had an engine go in free practice 1. Then I believe in free practice 2 had a crash, and then Lance crashed. Like, just, oh God, absolute nightmare weekend for the team. And again, for Vettel, you have to take into consideration, this guy doesn't have a ton of seat time in this car because he had COVID to start the season, and it took its toll on him big time, and he missed 2 races from it. So I don't know, guys, like, Seb, how do we feel about that? I mean, he wasn't there this weekend, and he's in a really tough spot right now, I think.
If there's a team out there that collectively needs a hug right now, I'd say it's Aston Martin, just the way that it's been a rough start. And then just even dialing it back to qualifying yesterday, I mean, that whole incident with Nicky and Lance, I mean, Lance then getting that grid penalty, and then getting 2 points slapped on his super license by the stewards for that, lack of situational awareness. I mean, that was just a bizarre situation. I mean, Nicky lets him by, and then he goes, and then I guess was it one of the Alphas coming up around as well, and then Nicky just dials it back up, and then as much as I think Lance was surprised that Nicky was there, I mean, he's got 2 mirrors on the side of his car. I mean, you got to take a look at them at some point. It just for me, that whole situation with Lance and qualifying kind of encapsulated the season so far, and unfortunately for them, it didn't get any better on Sunday.
As the British tabloid press would write, this was a shock weekend for Aston Martin. An already poor season is just compounded. And like you said, Seb's engine goes in free practice 1. Then he gets fined for riding a scooter unauthorized around the track. So that's 5,000 euros and a bunch of press we don't need. Then he slides wide at T9, T10 and crashes into the barriers. Then Lance drifts wide at T11 and destroys his front end. Then in Q1, just like Daly you described, he comes together with fellow Canadian Nicholas Latifi. And that's the last thing that Nicholas needs right now, is he's recovering mental health wise from a really tough start to the season.
Yeah.
And then of course, Vettel then crashes out during the race, takes the front of the car with him. And then on top of that, we see, and it was kind of interesting that Aston Martin took that really interesting strategy with Lance, brings him in on lap 2, puts him on the mediums, brings him right back in and puts him on the hard. But then he almost gets a penalty when he goes into that corner and overtakes Bottas by pushing him off the track. And then he does get a 5-second penalty because twice he cut to the right to block Bottas, and then he gets a penalty point. Then he got the 2 penalty points in qualifying. So now he's up to 8 penalty points in the last rolling 12 months. He's only 4 penalty points away from a 1-race ban. If they'd gone to Stephen King in the offseason and said, hey, write us a story, write us the worst possible start to the season, I don't think it could get much worse for this team. They're now the last team to have scored a point. They can't keep the truck cars on the track. And at least sometimes you can point to one specific thing, right? It's a reliability issue. It's a driver thing, but it just seems to be a little bit of everything right now for this team.
Yeah, it's like they're just living through a nightmare at the moment. They can't seem to wake up and come out of it. I think like, especially for Lance, he has to be super careful going forward now, especially with those super license points that he's tallied up. And that's going to be a big issue, I think, for him moving forward for the next few months, and how he races other drivers and what he does on the racetrack. You're going to have to pay attention to all of that. I thought he did a really nice job in the race, even though obviously he had that penalty. I thought he did a nice job holding on to a points paying position at one point, and then just keeping, I believe it was Gasly behind him for quite a few laps. Gasly has the much superior car than what Lance is driving. And I thought he did a really good job of like just kind of being there, kind of showing what they could have possibly done this weekend, which is, I think for the team, that's a bit of a bonus, but the stuff that happened in qualifying is absolutely ridiculous. And, Lance should know better. I mean, like, you have to stay on the racing line. Like, it makes no sense why you would curve over to the right like that. The racing line isn't even there. And at the same time, Nicholas let him go by because he was told he was on a hot lap. So he moved out of the way, and then Lance slows right up, and Nicholas has to keep the tires within the window. He's got to go by him. There's nothing he can do about it, right? It's just common sense. Is what you would do as a driver. Any one of us would have done it. So yeah, that was just not good all around for anybody. But yeah, it's a tough time down at Aston Martin. I like the car. I actually think if they can actually figure out some of their porpoising issues, if they can figure out how to gain back a lot of the grip, I think they'll be okay. Like, I think they actually have built a race car that's adaptable. And I think that was, talking to Andrew Green in the offseason, that was one of the biggest things he said to me was like, hey, like, we've kind of started to build a car here that can go either direction if we need to make some big upgrades. And some big upgrades are going to be coming to this car. I just don't know when at this point, but when they do get here, let's see what happens. Williams had a weekend too. I mean, the same thing, right? Same thing with them, same thing with Aston Martin, but there was a bright spot with Alex Albon. Guys, what did you think about this drive? Because for me, that was a highlight of the race for me, watching what Alex did on Sunday.
Well, yeah, I mean, it completely flew under the radar, right? I mean, he got a point out of all of that. I mean, he puts in this like amazing, what was it, something like 120 laps on one set of tires or something. Well, I'm exaggerating, obviously, but
57.
Yeah, I mean, he put 57 laps on those tires when Pirelli said that they only recommended 40, and he said the last 25 laps on those tires actually felt like the car qualifying pace. I mean, how he managed those tires, I mean, that blows my mind. And then they bring him in him on the penultimate lap to give him a fresh set of tires. I mean, not only was that like an aggressive strategy, I mean, it turned out to be brilliant. I mean, talk about like a highlight for the weekend for them. I mean, that's got to be, you know, if they needed a spark to kickstart their season, that has to be it. I mean, guys, I don't know. If it's not that gets them motivated, I don't know what will.
Dude, nothing got me more excited this race than that. And you didn't really even understand it was happening until probably lap 35, lap 40, when you start to realize we're 41 laps in and he's still on the C2 hards that he started with. And then you start to realize he's going to go almost the entire race distance on this one tire. And, you know, he was quoted after the race saying, you know, it just got better and better. And by the end of it, it felt like qualifying laps for the last 25 laps or so. For me, I think, that C2 hard, like, I think there's some really good news here. And maybe what he showed is, one, he was absolutely the right choice for that team. You know, Williams was absolutely lambasted in the media because they didn't take Nick, who was Mercedes' choice to come over from Formula E. They went to Alex Albon from the enemy Red Bull team, but Albon seems to have been just a sensational choice for him. He put in a phenomenal drive. And I think the other thing that we saw yesterday during that Grand Prix is this Williams car might be significantly more capable than maybe we've been giving it credit for, that on the right day, on the right track, with the right compound, this could be a much, much scarier car than we've given it credit for being. So I think that was a revelation, but it was so great to see them score the point. They're now no longer the only team, or one of the two only teams without a point, but he looked absolutely fantastic. And it also gives me confidence for Nicky too, because for Nicky to be able to sit there, and obviously his weekend didn't necessarily go the way he'd wanted it to. He was on a very different strategy. He had that ugly incident, obviously, that we just discussed with Lance in Q1. But for him now to know that, hey, there's more pace in this car than maybe I expected, I think that's a good news story.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, you make some really great points there. I feel that for this car in particular, on that C2 tire, they are extremely competitive. So Nicholas starts on, I believe he was on the medium to start the race. Alex was on the hard. And the car just chewed through the mediums, like just chewed them up. I think, like, you know, Nicholas had a really good start. He was ahead of Alex for, I think it was probably about 10 laps or so. And then same thing happened where the tires just kind of dropped off a cliff and they just stopped working completely. He's on the radio like, you got to pit me. You got to pit me. Same thing in Saudi Arabia. Guys, you got to pit me. You got to pit me. Boom, into the wall, right? He's telling them like, hey, these things are telling me something. They're not working anymore. You got to bring me in. You got to bring him in. So they bring him in. Alex is consistently in the 124s, consistently for the race. He's 124, 124.7, 124.5, 124.7, 124.8, 124.9, et cetera, et cetera. Nicky comes in, gets the hard tire compound as well. He goes out. I think his first few laps was like 126, 125, and then he's 124.8, 124.9, 124.7. He starts going faster than Alex, and then obviously, you know, the tire just, it lived very nicely on this car. And I think one of the biggest issues is that they need to deal with, obviously, with the porpoising as well, but is how this car uses the tire and how to get mechanically, and more of a mechanical grip, I think, as well, how to get the tire in the right operating window so the drivers are confident. Alex, I think, has kind of found that. Nicholas hasn't yet. I think missing that testing session back in Bahrain where the left rear collapsed on him at the start of testing, I think that really affected him, simply because he hasn't gotten the seat time in this car. So I talked to him about it on Thursday, and, you know, we were chatting about a whole bunch of stuff, and I brought up, you know, hey, what about these tires, right? Like, do they offer any warning signs that they're dropping off? And he basically said, not really. You know, the tires are, they just simply drop off a cliff. He's like, once they go, they just go, and there's not really much warning sign, you know, that they give. And so I think as a driver for myself, that probably rattled me a little bit for sure. But I think, you know, Hammy, like you said, once he starts to kind of get to grips and get the confidence back, I'm sure he'll be back in the fight. At the moment, it just feels like such bad luck keeps coming this guy's way, eh? Like it just doesn't stop for some reason. But hey, who knows? You know, this is Formula One, and he's got to deal with it. And if Alex is doing this, he's going to have to do it too. And that's just the way things roll. So
absolutely.
Yeah. And it's going to be interesting to watch. I'm going to be very interested to watch this. Yeah, big time. It's going to be fascinating because, if he can pull it together, if we go back to free practice 2, he's close to the same pace as Alex. Like, I think he was like a 10th or 2/10 off in free practice 2. He got blown out of the water in free practice 1, if I remember correctly. And then in the race, qualifying, he didn't really get a chance to stitch together a lap because then he obviously had the incident with Lance. So he never really got to go out and do proper quali on a fresh set of softs. So it's gonna be tough for him. He's up against the wall, I think, at this moment. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's coming to the point that it's going to be make or break pretty soon because there's so many guys that the drivers' market is wide open this year. Was it like half the grid is out of contract by the end of this year? So they're going to want to. If Alex is starting to show signs that there's potential in this car and that they can maybe start putting it into the points, then they're going to want to have 2 drivers that are capable of that. So I think Nicky's fully aware of the situation, and he's probably feeling that pressure. So hopefully he can rise to the occasion and deliver.
The only thing I would add, because I agree with both of you, is that never before has the funding from a pay driver, and I don't think it's necessarily fair to call Nicky a pay driver. His dad, through his father's food group, does bring some significant sponsorship dollars to the Williams team, but never has the role of a pay driver been less relevant than now with the cost cap pegged at $140 million. It just doesn't matter. It makes more sense for the team to invest in the best possible driver because you can get more of a return by chasing points in the Constructors' Championship to bring in cash money and prize money. And then you're even more attractive to other sponsors. So I think he knows it daily, just like you said, he doesn't need to be told how precarious this situation is. And just like we talked about off the top, it's a deep challenge. It's a deep marathon of a championship. There's 23 races left. Hopefully we'll get to the point where this is long forgotten. And, we always look back to 2017, and that was Lance's rookie year. He scored a podium. There were some bright spots. He's cashed in a couple of different points finishes, but he DNF'd basically the first 4 races, just trying to come to grips with that car. So for me, hopefully it's a little bit of Nicky shaking off some of those, I would say, psychological gremlins based on that crash in Abu Dhabi, based on the double crashes in Jeddah. Hopefully he can shake off this incident in qualifying, knowing that he was not at fault. And then hopefully he can come to grips with the new compounds and with the car. But it's good, I think, that Albon's there because he needs that frame of reference. So he totally understands and has a clear expectation of what's capable of him or what should be expected of him on the track.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. Drivers, F1 contracts. So for drivers who are out of contract at the end of this season, it's Alonso, Carlos Sainz at the moment. I think he's going to stick around at Ferrari. Sergio Perez, Sebastian Vettel, Stroll, Gasly, Tsunoda, Albon, Joe, Schumacher. Those are all 2022 contracts that are up. So that'll be interesting. A lot of moving pieces, boys. I'm excited. A lot of moving pieces, a lot of opening seats. You know me, I love the driver market.
Well, silly season's going to get very silly this season by the sound of it, with all those, seats coming available, all the rumors that are going to fly around at some point.
It's like you and I have talked about before. The best part of the NBA is free agency and talking about free agency.
Absolutely.
And it's becoming the same with Formula One. Silly season is now the most entertaining part. And talking about, like, as we did all of 2019, where is Vettel going? Or 20, where's Vettel going? Where's Vettel going? And last year, where's Russell going? It's a lot of fun to talk about driver changes.
Yeah, totally.
Well, did I miss anything, guys, or did we pretty much comb through this entire race?
I think we got everything. The one thing I just wanted to mention just before we go, we had Lando and Daniel Ricciardo finishing P5 and 6 for McLaren. So they're I don't want to say that they're back. I mean, they were pretty anonymous the first 2 races of the year, but they're certainly going to be the team that I'm going to be watching going into Imola in 2 weeks. It's like, was this a flash in the pan, or are they starting to get this one figured out?
This is track dependent for sure for McLaren. I think this is just a similar. I think like when we saw the first 2 races, so like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, it's kind of like there's, and Mark, you brought this up the last time you were on, were we talking about the surfaces? You know, if you go to Bahrain, that surface is, well, one, the track is more, like it's probably one of the slower tracks on the calendar, so it requires more mechanical grip. But on the other side of it, it also has a pavement that's very abrasive and chews the tire up big time. And then you go to Jeddah, which is obviously faster, but the surface is not as abrasive as that in Bahrain. Then you go to Australia, you have another surface that's more, this is more of a proper Formula One track, in my opinion. I think this is the race that kind of tells us where kind of everybody is. That's what I think. And I think when we get to Imola, like I think this was kind of the race that showed us where all the team is. And I don't know. I think McLaren is actually legit, like a legit good team here. Maybe not obviously with like Ferrari and Red Bull and potentially Mercedes, but like sure. I still think they're one of the top teams in the constructor standings. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, if you look at the constructors right now, they have only 24 points. They're third in the constructors right now. But I mean, we've seen the way that some of the teams in front of them have been dropping points, that I wouldn't be surprised if they can put it together, that they might be able to put a little bit of a run together. But it's been shaky, right? I mean, the first couple of the races was not very convincing from them. This past weekend was much more what I think we've become used to McLaren over maybe the last 18 months, maybe if you want to push it to 2 years or so. So I'm hoping that this is actually a sign of things to come, but you know, like I said off the top of the show, I'm kind of conservative when it comes to making these predictions. I'm gonna have to see after what happens in Imola in a couple of weeks, and then maybe after Miami, then we'll have a good feel. Okay, well, are they still struggling here or there? Or they finally got this thing figured out, and then they can just motor on through the rest of the year and actually contend and see if they can put the fight to somebody in the constructors above them.
All I want to say is watch out for Alpine. Plan is coming, I think.
Yeah, well, I mean, Fernando, I know that he really dropped off at the end of the race there, but I mean, he had that hydraulics. Yeah, I mean, he had that that crash in qualifying, but I mean, he showed some pace. I mean, if he didn't have that hydraulic issue in qualifying that kind of messed his afternoon up, I mean, he showed some pretty impressive moments at times there. And let's not forget that Esteban Ocon slid into 7th rather quietly on Sunday afternoon. So there's another one to keep an eye on.
His quali lap, Mark, Esteban Ocon's quali lap, I think it was in it was either Q1 or it was in Q1. Oh God, I thought he was gonna crash the car, man. At least 3 separate times that the final push lap, like just to punch his ticket into Q2, dude. I seriously thought there was a couple moments I was riding on board with him, and I'm like, this guy's gonna bin this car for sure. There's just no way because I think he knew that Alonso was going to be really quick. And I think Ocon's just like, I'm either going to crash this thing or I'm going to get as close as possible to him. So I'm not going to look embarrassed here. And then Alonso, man, that would have been a pole lap. And I think it would have been tough to beat. Yeah,
that was a shame that the hydraulics went on him like that, because we were watching it. We were on the edge of our seats. It was impressive. And, coming out of that quali session, I have to admit, I was feeling a little bit disappointed. I feel that we got, with that issue and then Alonso ending up in the tires, I actually felt kind of cheated because I thought we were going to see something really, really special from Fernando there.
Same here,
It's unfortunate, and I don't have a lot to add, but we talk about, obviously, Red Bull hemorrhaging points so far because of some reliability issues. Alpine's another team, right? Like, if they could dial in some of these really small reliability issues, they could be scoring big points as well. They've had some really small, minor reliability issues that have had massive consequences for them in the Constructors' Championship. But, we talk about the fact that, and these are big ifs, if Mercedes can bring a great upgrade package that puts them closer to Ferrari, and Red Bull can dial in their reliability issues, then all of a sudden we have 3 teams and potentially 6 drivers that could be competing for race wins. But at the same time, it's not going to take a lot more potentially for Alpine to inch their way up there, and McLaren. And again, we're only 3 races into a championship where the regulations are completely new. And we knew that some teams were going to do really well out of the gate and some teams weren't. And what we're probably seeing with Red Bull and Mercedes is simply a consequence of the fact that they committed all of their resources during the previous calendar year to the previous championship because it went right down to the wire. And it should probably be expected that Ferrari was going to be a front runner because they weren't developing last year's car. They were all in on 2022. But I think what's exciting is we should see some of these teams start to button up some of these reliability issues. And for a team like Mercedes, eventually they're going to bring an upgrade package that's really going to make a difference to them.
Yeah, constructors standings at the moment, Ferrari leading the way with 104 points, then Mercedes, Red Bull, McLaren, Alpine, Alfa Romeo, Haas, AlphaTauri, Williams, and then Aston Martin, who is last and has failed to score a point yet, but I do think they will be scoring points this season, that's for sure. Guys, thanks very much for coming on today. This has been great. Let me know what you got going on and where everyone can find your stuff, because you guys do some really great work over on your podcast.
So yeah, you can find me on Twitter at MarkDailyF1, and that's DAILEY F1. You can search us up on Apple and Spotify, anywhere you get your podcast. We're the Scuderia F1 podcast. You can find my friend and co-host, Mr. Mark Hamilton, on Twitter as well. He's at Mark and Van City, and that's the best place to connect with us. And Tim, always a pleasure. Always love talking Formula One with you.
Thanks
it's been
so
a
much,
blast.
Tim. Yeah, guys, thanks again. Appreciate it.